Hi, my name is Carolyn Roberts. I am an assistant professor at Yale University in history, history of science and medicine, and African American studies. And I'm here in Richmond, Virginia at Science Pub RVA. And I'm going to be speaking about African and African-descended cultures of healing and curing. We're going to be thinking about how African medical and botanical knowledge helped African people survive slavery and beyond.
Dr. Carolyn Roberts. Wow, it's wonderful to be here in Richmond, Virginia. This is my first time here, and I wish I had longer, and I wish it wasn't so cold, because then I could explore more, but it is familiar for having come from Connecticut. So I'm really happy to see you here, and let's begin. So, what comes to mind when we think of medical encounters between Africans and Europeans? And oftentimes what we think about is this image of the outstretched hands. So, Africa in the Western mind has long been considered a place that is diseased and dependent and dark. But that is not the Africa that I study in the period that I spend all of my time doing research. It's a very different kind of Africa. And so the Africa that I want to introduce to you today has to do with Africa and African American people giving medical and scientific knowledge to Europeans and Americans. So we're going to change the tables around a little bit. I want to take you on a journey, and this journey asks us to think about how these vulnerable and marginalized peoples gave much needed medical and scientific knowledge to Europeans and to Americans. So we're going to be crossing oceans and continents. We're going to be leaping from the West African coast to the Americas, to the US mainland, to Haiti, to Suriname, to Jamaica. And as we jump and skip and travel, I want to let you know that there's a lot at stake in this journey. Right? Because this is a time when people were turned into saleable goods. This is a time when slavery was the law, and when violence and rape and terror and brutality were sanctioned not only by law, but by religion and by custom and by society at large. And so it isn't going to be an easy journey, but there's a lot of healing in this story. There's a lot of knowledge that is being produced in this story. And so I invite you to come along with me. So I study the slave trade. And if you don't recall what that was from your history classes in, say, high school or college, I'm going to give you the 1 minute or minute and a half overview. Right? The Atlantic slave trade was the largest forced oceanic migration ever to occur in human history. It lasted for 366 years. Most of the Western European nations were involved. European nations sailed to West and West Central and East Africa with ships laden with luxury goods so that they could purchase very valuable enslaved children, women, and men who were desperately needed for their labor. So millions of enslaved children, women, and men are swept up into the slave trade. And these were human beings. These were human beings. They were artists, they were musicians, they were scientists and craftspeople. They were teachers and healers and religious leaders. They were young children. As you can see here, an image from a slave ship. A lot of young children. There were babies, pregnant women, and others. And so these extraordinary human beings were ripped from their homes and family and kin. And they were chained and beaten and herded on board ships of death that were called floating tombs. So these individuals were to be forced laborers in the Americas. They were to be treated like beasts of burden and enslaved for generations. And so it's very important to remember this was a world-changing event. Their labor produced vast amounts of wealth from slave-produced commodities such as sugar and tobacco and coffee and cotton. These commodities formed the world's first system of multinational mass market consumer goods. Multinational mass market consumer goods. And so the immense profits that are generated buttress the economies of Europe and eventually the new American Republic. So, when slave traders, merchants, sailors, and others are on these journeys, one part of the story that we don't tend to think about is that they got sick. They got very, very sick, and Europeans died in high numbers. Right. Europeans encountered new disease environments. And so this is an image of Cape Coast Castle in present-day Ghana. Maybe some of you have been there and seen this. And when you look at this image, when I look at this image, it sort of exudes a sense of domination and control, mastery. But places like Cape Coast Castle and other slave factories scattered along the West African coast, they were anything but spaces of mastery when it came to disease and death. There are many times when this castle functioned as one large hospital with only a few human beings alive and healthy. Mortality for Europeans in Africa was 4 times higher than in India and the Caribbean. And this was due to hyperendemic malaria and European vulnerability to yellow fever. And so life expectancy for Europeans on the West African coast, it was between 4 and 5 years. So what did they do? They relied on West African medical and botanical knowledge. They looked and saw who was alive and who managed to stay alive. And they had developed their ethnomedical traditions for thousands of years. And so that is what they did. So, this is a very new story. To research the story of West African medicine in the context of the Atlantic slave trade, it took me throughout the United Kingdom. And so I looked in dusty boxes, and I studied maps, and I pored over natural histories, and I read rare books concerning travel accounts that were written in French and Italian and Dutch and English. And so as I combed through these records and the correspondence, the ship's logs, the account books, and the ledgers, the importance of West African medicine was clear. It was hidden in plain sight. So I learned, for example, from these dusty boxes of papers, that the British created an enslaved medical labor force to serve their health needs. And they also were used to serve the health needs of those that we should not call shipping slaves, but it is the phrase that we tend to use. Shipping slaves are the enslaved people that are targeted for shipment to the Americas. So the enslaved medical labor force, they're situated at Cape Coast Castle. They are enslaved and bonded there for life. They are branded, they're given new names. Their job is to provide medical care. And so sometimes they are going into the vermin-infested dungeons where these slaves targeted for shipment to the Americas are being held, waiting for the arriving slave ships. So this enslaved medical corps included African doctors, like a man named Atum. There were doctresses. Their names were Didi and Amano and Abinaba and Yafua. There were 8-year-old enslaved boys like Jack, who served as a medical apprentice until finally becoming a doctor in his own right when he got into his late teens. And part of what I also discovered was how efficacious their medical and surgical interventions were. So this is a page from, it's impossible to read, but I just wanted to show you sort of an image of what some of these documents look like. It's a page from a letter book, and it's filled with letters coming from West Africa. And one section of this letter explains that Europeans have been seeing West Africans use many effective medicines, and that they can cure health conditions through pharmacy and through surgery. And so Chaplain John Smith is a wonderful example of just how this worked, because he was stationed as a minister at Cape Coast Castle. And he studied with West African healers to learn how they healed themselves so he could send the information back to London. He learned of cures for stomachache, for smallpox, and for worms, for venereal disease and toothaches, dysentery, dermatological conditions, and hemorrhaging. And a Dutch merchant who was with John Smith, this chaplain, at the same time, he too exclaimed that he had seen many of his countrymen cured by African doctors when European physicians were at a loss of what to do. And he went on to say that he believed African medicines were more successful than European medicines in West Africa. There were many such letters that I came across. And so as I kept finding and reading these documents, it seemed to be very clear. But what kind of medicine were they practicing? So that was my next question. They started to record the kinds of medicines that were being used. So one of the medicines that Europeans observed was this. This is velvet tamarind. They said that African doctors soaked the pulp of the fruit in water and then consumed the resulting beverage, and that it was used as a very great fever remedy. So researchers today have confirmed the analgesic and antimicrobial and antimalarial benefits of velvet tamarind. Another medicine that they observed was African basil being used, and this was also a fever remedy. So Africans boiled the leaves, and they created a decoction, which is a concentrated sort of essence from the leaves. And they would drink it, but they would also use the extracted liquor in a steam bath, and they would steam themselves 4 times a day. So when I did research on African basil and looked at some of the pharmacological properties, in chemical screenings, we know that the essential oils that are in these leaves have the antimalarial properties. And so researchers today confirm that the steam bath is particularly effective for obtaining the antimalarial benefits. And so when Europeans are noting that there are things that Africans can cure that Europeans don't know how to cure, it starts to become clear that some of these healing remedies were very efficacious. And there's many more examples. There is guavas that are being used for dysentery, and papaya seeds for worms, which if you look up, it's still being used to cure worms, plantains for diarrhea, castor oil, the leaves are wrapped over swollen limbs to help with edema and different forms of swelling. Coconut was ingested to help with stomach aches. So whether cultivated in gardens or gathered from the rainforests, these were the healing remedies that African people used. So when we move from West Africa and we think about what happened when enslaved children, women, and men were forced onto the slave ships and transported to the Americas, we know from this history that they brought their healing knowledge with them. We know that many of them were medical and botanical experts, and we know that they also spread African healing knowledge throughout the Americas. And so I'm going to explain that. So upon arrival in the Americas, enslaved Africans engaged in a process that researchers today call migrant ethnobotany. And so this is when you move to a new land. You might bring plants from your home and try to grow them in your new home. Sometimes Africans are bringing seeds that are in their hair, hidden, to bring them to the Americas. So they are bringing things with them. But alternatively, you might just learn the new therapeutic landscape and try to figure out how to replace certain materia medica that you used from your home and replace it with things that you're discovering in this new landscape. And so African people are doing this process, and they're working alongside Native American people to understand this new landscape. And so the result might be very surprising. Enslaved medical practitioners abounded in the Americas. And it's incredible as scholars begin to trace all of this healing knowledge. So enslaved women who were in what would become Haiti, they were so widely praised for their medical knowledge because it often proved more successful than European medicine on the island. In Jamaica, enslaved healers were held in such high regard that the lieutenant governor of Jamaica, Sir Henry Morgan, sent for black doctors when European treatments were unsuccessful. And for example, this plant, migrant ethnobotany, yes, I've missed my slide. But this is, one of the things I love about this slide is that the individual is carrying rice grains. And there's a wonderful scholar named Judith Carney who wrote an article, which is one of my favorite essays, called With Grains of Rice in Her Hair. And this was about the transport of rice to the Americas by enslaved people. But moving forward, Madjoe bitters. This plant was named after an enslaved woman in Jamaica named Madjoe. And Madjoe used this plant to create many efficacious cures, especially for venereal disease. And people started to rely on Madjoe bitters in order to cure difficult diseases when Europeans were unable to do so. And as you can see, she has entered, our knowledge of botany. This bitter root, Quassia amara, is named after an enslaved man named Quassi, who was from Suriname. And Quassi created an effective fever remedy and stomach tonic from this plant. And it ended up becoming a very important drug export from Suriname during this period of time because he was able to prove how useful it would be. And an enslaved man, we don't have an image of him, but his name was Ernie Tzimmes. And some of you maybe know of Ernie Tzimmes. Ernie Tzimmes, who helped to introduce the African practice of smallpox inoculation to Boston, where it became adopted in that city. And I could go on. So what does all of this mean? It is true, this knowledge was valuable, and it did bolster botanical science and medical knowledge during this period of time. But the cultures of healing and curing used by enslaved people had a much deeper significance. They weren't necessarily interested in contributing to metropolitan scientific circles, although they did. The cultures of healing and curing used by enslaved people, in the face of the terror and the tumult of slavery in the Americas, offered spaces of healing. Their bodies were beaten mercilessly. Their health challenges were great. Rape was frequent. Reproductive struggles had to be managed. Mental health was compromised because of the separation of families. People took to the swamps. They fought and they died for freedom. Healing took them into the fields and into the forests. And they were guided by the spirit world. Women healers like Lulu Wilson. Women healers like Lulu Wilson. I always love to pause at Lulu Wilson. So she's blind in this image. And she tells this story in the WPA narratives about how she thinks she was blind because the woman who was her mistress used to tie her down and beat her and put snuff into her eyes. And so she says that's how she became blind, but she served as a nurse for over 50 years, Lulu Wilson. So women like Lulu Wilson, they held on to a sacred view of healing. Physical health and community health and spiritual health were profoundly interconnected. They taught their children the meaning of signs and wonders in the physical landscape. They encountered God in the peach tree leaves, in the swamps and in the woods and in the forest. And the divine presence would help them see medicines. And they talk in the slave narratives about listening to trees. They believed that the Lord had provided roots and herbs for every imaginable illness that human beings could face. So one enslaved woman healer told an interviewer that she had been suffering from swollen limbs, and she says, and I quote her here, "I asked God to heal me. The Spirit directed me to get some peach tree leaves and beat them up and put them on my limbs. I did this, and in a day or two, that swelling left me. And I haven't been bothered since. Dr. Jesus tells me what to do." So although their bodies were beaten and violated and abused, although they were treated worse than dogs, as one enslaved man said in a very chilling recording, although they were considered the wretched of the earth in so many ways, these healing practices helped them keep on keeping on. And although the idea of healing and what we think it might mean in the context of slavery, where you're faced with ongoing kinds of brutality, one scholar writes about healing as being the power to endure. I'm going to stop there.
Okay, so first of all, by far, you are the hottest doctor that we have ever had here. Like, you need your own TV show, please. Like, an orator, wow, give her a hand. Like, great. You did a great job. Wow. Okay, so I have two questions. Why didn't I learn this in school? And the second question, besides the economic benefit, why do you think big pharma is not going back to these natural, now that we have science, like, why don't we go back to this natural way of healing? Those are my two questions. Oh, and my name is Luce. It rhymes with goose. Hi, everyone.
Wonderful. So I can,
Yes,
okay,
please do.
so the million-dollar question. When I teach this material to students, they are so disturbed because they don't understand, why did I never know about this? We have to really reckon with how we deal with teaching about slavery and about the difficult parts of our past. It can be really tough because I think there's an instinct to want to sort of paper over that which is uncomfortable. But my perspective on it is that true love for a person, a place, it comes when you know all of it, doesn't it? You love despite the fact that your partner is doing this and that. You love despite it. You love, that is love. To love when you aren't looking at the truth, it's like falling in love with, someone online you've never met in person. You see an image, but there's no real soul there. You don't have chemistry. You don't know the truth of the individual. And so my plea would be that we try to love more maturely. Your second question, yes. So it's incredible because there is so much money to be made that multinational pharmaceutical companies are going to parts of Africa, meeting with indigenous healers. People are calling it a kind of biopiracy, learning about these drugs, submitting them to chemical screenings, and trying to produce them. So for example, there is African sandalwood, nkula bark, which is one of the earliest sort of medicinals that I read about from Angola in the 17th century. That is right now being studied to be used as an antibiotic to deal with some of the resistant antibiotics that we have, circulating at the moment. And so they are working quite ardently. There are certain laws that are being put in place to try to protect the knowledge. But
Say more about smallpox vaccination and its origins.
Yeah, so in terms of filling in the story of Onesimus, so Onesimus, it's such a wonderful and interesting story. So Cotton Mather, you might have heard of Cotton Mather, right? He's a minister in Boston. He owns a slave, and this slave is named Onesimus. Now, smallpox is ravaging Boston. This is 1721, and he learns from Onesimus that in West Africa, where he's from, they have this practice of inoculation. He describes the practice to him. Says that you take a little bit of the pus and you inject it into another person, you give them a little bit of the disease, and then their body develops a resistance, and they are fine. And so when he learns this from Onesimus, people in Boston are not pleased, because he gets this knowledge from a slave. So you see, already by 1720s, when we're talking about the American mainland, the idea of African medicine being efficacious, all of that has already begun to change, because they're very suspicious. And so what happens is that Cotton Mather tries to promote this knowledge. And he is in conversation with people at the Royal Society in London. People at the Royal Society are doing their own research. They're realizing that smallpox inoculation is also being done in Turkey. And there's a little bit of a hint that it's also being done in China as well. And so Cotton Mather is saying we really need to follow this practice. People are so alarmed and so upset that they firebomb his house. He, in response, starts to do some writings. And one of his writings, he's making the case that if we, as Americans in Boston, if we can learn about how to cure snakebite from Native American people, why can we not learn about smallpox inoculation from African people? Well, eventually what happens is that it does get experimented on and practiced. And so eventually Zabdiel Boylston ends up being the individual who starts to do those experiments with smallpox inoculation. But Onesimus is such an important part of that story, and we usually don't hear about him. And it's really, you're thinking about the history of what would eventually become vaccination in the United States. It too is tied to our history of slavery.
And is that the first type of any inoculation, not just smallpox?
Yes, yes, indeed.
Hello, how you doing? Right here. My question is, they don't teach this in school, obviously. It's new to a lot of us. If we wanted to learn more about this topic, what would be the best way for us to do research?
Oh, you have a book project.
I do.
But you probably have some favorite resources. But we should say that there'll be a book project soon.
There will be a book project. My book is going to be called To Heal and to Harm, Medicine, Knowledge, and Power in the Atlantic Slave Trade. But because it focuses on the slave trade part of the story, if you're interested in thinking a little bit more about this later period, the period when Lulu Wilson is writing, this is 19th century antebellum America, there's some really wonderful sources and scholars. Charla Fett, her book Working Cures is a must-read in this. A scholar named Londa Schiebinger, who writes on the West Indies. And she has a wonderful book. Her latest book is called The Secret Cures of Slaves. Judith Carney, who I mentioned before, she has a number of different writings that are just wonderful. And so to get at the story of the Americas, so what my book project does is I'm trying to sort of move the focus to if we know now from the research of these other scholars about the kind of enslaved medical knowledge in the Americas, why don't we know about what was going on in Africa? How do we bring that story back to think about African cultures of healing and curing. And so that's one of the major interventions that I'm making.
Thank you very much for the illuminating talk. And my question is, I'll preface it by just qualifying that we as Europeans took by force and brutality so much from that area. Was this taken in the same way ever? These doctors that complied in the castles, were they ever forced to comply? Did you find evidence of that?
Well, it's a very good question. They were enslaved, right? They were enslaved. And what being enslaved meant when you were at the castle, as opposed to sort of other forms of slavery that you might be familiar with, where you might be able to purchase your freedom or marry a free person and get your freedom that way, the enslaved healers that are working at Cape Coast Castle and at other slave factories, they are very much constrained in their ability to really do a lot of things. They cannot buy their freedom. If they marry someone who is free, that person becomes enslaved, and their children become enslaved. If they try to escape, so they're at Cape Coast Castle, they're in West Africa. Let's say that they tried to escape, they went into the town, they tried to hide. What would be the repercussions? The British and the other Europeans are making arrangements with local leaders to say, if one of our enslaved people escapes, you must bring them back. Now, let's say you escaped and you were successful, and no one found you, you were in hiding. But let's say a slave trader, an African slave trader, found you, and then you'd get shipped to the Americas. So the choice between being enslaved at the castle or being sent to the Americas weighed heavily on these individuals. So, the British in particular, they didn't want there to be, although there was violence against them, they wanted to try to create a form of slavery that allowed for small pockets of freedom in the midst of all of that. So, for example, some of these individuals, some of these enslaved doctors, they have their own little huts to live in. And what they're doing is they're using these huts also as sick care spaces. And so in the records, they'll say, Atum cured Shamba, sick slave, in his home. And he's given some goods for that. So there, it's a sort of, this wonderful scholar, Richard Newman, writes really well about how to understand this sort of mixture of slavery, which in some ways follows both West African patterns of slavery at the time as well as European.
Okay, thank you so much for that, delivering these hidden figures throughout history. Question for you, looking at today and juxtaposing today's health conditions in Africa versus how it was back then, what happened? What changed?
Such a good question. I don't feel entirely qualified to give you the great answer, but I'll tell you what I do know. Because my work on more modern day medicine is more centered in the US. Colonialism was one of the things that happened. So for example, when we're looking at these spaces in West Africa, when colonialism really takes root in West Africa and other parts of Africa is really the late 19th century. And what happens is that so many areas that were previously isolated from all of the epidemiological conditions, they weren't the people at Cape Coast Castle, they weren't the people on the coast who had had intercourse with Europeans for generations. So much of the continent ended up falling into what they call a great dying, because they were assaulted with new disease environments because of the onslaught of the Europeans. And so that's, in similar way, people talk about the great dying that happened with the Native American people. Another great dying did happen in many parts of Africa. Now, one of the things that happened as well, in which when I meet people and talk to them, and they're from Africa, they're always so surprised by my research because they say, we were always told that our medicine was superstition. We were told it was worthless. We were told it didn't work. We were told that we should use Western medicine. And so there is that stigma also that is overlaying this story. Now, in terms of some of the sort of like diseases and things like that that are happening right now, it's hard for me to make sense of because in the period I study, ideas about contagion, for example, they have these ideas about contagion. When people have measles or mumps or all these diseases, chickenpox, they go into the forest. They separate themselves away. They understand contagion. In this early period, they are understanding many different ideas about public health. So I don't know if that fissure was also part of the disappearance of your knowledge because of what happens when you are assuming European ideas about who you are and about what your culture is.
I'm wondering about, given the danger of getting pregnant, women who were, slaves who were raped, if they had children, they could be sold away. I would think that birth control would have been, or abortifactants would have been an important skill for these doctors, and I would like you to address that.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. In the Americas, there was a huge concern about these drugs that would cause abortions. In some of the records that you have coming from the West Indies, when they're talking about why the slave population is not growing in places like Jamaica and other parts of the Caribbean, and why, because the natural born population in the West Indies isn't growing, we need the slave trade, that's the argument. Some of the things that they are identifying is abortion. The different kinds of plants that are being used. There's a wonderful scholar, Londa Schiebinger, her first book, Plants and Empire, deals with that quite well. So it was something that was very much at work. I don't know, like with the records as they are, it's so hard to know, like, how were they making sense of interpreting what they were doing. I don't know if anyone has come across any sources that help you get at that. But we do know how important Black midwives were and how important they were in terms of helping women in terms of their health more broadly, not just for the period of birth.
Thank you so much for being here. It's just been an amazing evening. I have to say I'm greatly intrigued by Lulu Wilson. Is there any way you could flesh her out a little bit more?
She is an extraordinary woman. So I don't know if you're familiar with the WPA narratives, the Works Progress Administration. So the Works Progress Administration ended up going and doing interviews with people who were formerly enslaved. And this is during the 1920s. And so all of these, there are thousands of pages of documents of these interviews, and some of them also have recordings attached to them. And so what I know about Lulu Wilson is really from the interview. And, there isn't that much more that I've gotten from her in terms of sort of like the aspect of healing and nursing work that she did. But she did talk about how in her family, the forced pairing of her parents, which was something that often happened during slavery, when her mother was not having enough children. So she does speak about that. But my favorite part about what Lulu Wilson says is she thanks the president because she feels like she's going to be able to get a little bit of a pension and a little bit of recognition for what she went through. And she said, I want him to know that slavery were the worst days. They were worst past telling. And I don't ever want to see them back again. And so, yeah, Lulu Wilson, she's special.
Okay. Thank you for taking my question. I'd like you to speak on, if you could, the propagation of the plants in terms of their arrival here in the Americas, and if there are any, in particular, plant-rich areas that maybe haven't been explored, maybe in the rural areas where there were plantations, or maybe even a great deal of enslaved populace that may have been freed and had to live on their own. I would like to know if you have any background or information about that.
That's a good question. I wish I had more, but I will tell you that in some of the maroon communities, which is where scholars like Judith Carney, who also does a certain amount of ethnobotanical research, and Tilda Van Andel, they will go to meet with maroon communities who are in very rural areas. I know that there's some people that go up to maroon country in Jamaica as well to try to study, some of the plant knowledge that's there. People also go to the Gullah people and look at some of the healing traditions that they have. And so I think that some of that, what you're saying is really quite true, that in some of these areas that are more pristine in terms of human, changing the landscape by human intervention, some of those areas do remain wonderfully rich for people. But one thing that I'm troubled by was something that I learned recently, and that is people who do this kind of research, ethnobotanists, it is becoming less of an area of study across the board. And so I started having some meetings with some plant biologists and people like that to ask them if it were possible to go to some of these parts of West Africa, which I read about in the archives, when there are plants that we don't yet know the identification for, and can we put a team of people together to try to do this identification? And that would be the work of the ethnobotanists, but it is not being taught and it's not developing as it did. And so it is troubling. Maybe if there's more interest from people, we can recover more of that knowledge. But I would point you to Judith Carney and Tilda Van Andel for that.
Thank you.
Yes. What is your aim and purpose of what you've done other than just to spread knowledge? Do you do research also?
Yes, I've spent almost a decade doing research to put this material together in a PhD program. That is, what we do. Is as historians, we spend a lot of time doing research, and so I've been to, I guess, 40 different archival repositories looking at original documents that were written by various people and spending time with voices from the past that are in these records. And so my book that will be coming out in a couple of years is going to have some of that material in there. It will be sort of the pinnacle of this research. My book itself is the African medicine part of it is one sort of aspect of the project. The reason why the book is called To Heal and to Harm is because I'm thinking more broadly about how the modernization of medicine was impacted by the Atlantic slave trade. And so I study the pharmaceutical industry and the drugs that are being put on board the ships and the rise of surgery and anatomy, the modernization of medicine, and how all of those things are also part of this story. So it's a big, broad story. But the African medicine piece is particularly important because nobody has actually done research to find what pre-colonial, pre-19th century West African medicine was. And so that has been sort of a labor of love in a way, to give knowledge back to these communities as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Roberts. That is a wrap.
Thank you.